Good afternoon, everyone. You're very welcome. You're very welcome to today's Irish Studies seminar. As usual, we have a hybrid event, so we've got an audience online who I hope can hear me and see the slides as well. We have the slides up behind us, and we have an audience in the room. So without further ado, let me introduce this afternoon's speaker, who's Dr. Briony Widdis, who is an ESRC postdoctoral research fellow in the School of HAP here in Queen's. And she is leading the project on museums, empire and Northern Irish identity, delivered in partnership with the National Museums for Northern Ireland, the Irish Museums Association, the NI Museums Council, and the Centre for the Study of Historic Irish Houses and Estates at Maynooth. And the focus of the project is on legacies of empire and colonialism in Northern Ireland and the role of museums in these debates. And it seeks to use public anthropology and social history to explore how contemporary identities connect with colonial collections. So Briony's going to speak to us this afternoon on the topic of the finest war canoe in Europe, John Casement, displacement and ethnographic histories in Belfast. So Briony, over to you.
Thank you very much. I want to just acknowledge, first of all, that kind of all of the research that I'm going to present today is based on the archives of National Museums NI, and I'm very grateful to them for providing access to the photographs and to their own unpublished records behind the scenes. I also want to thank the Public Record Office and QUB Special Collections, which have made their archives available for this research. I'm conscious as well, looking around the room, that many people will know a lot about this history already, and some people have known the canoe certainly for longer than I have. So I'm hoping this will be a conversation in which you provide the benefit of your own understanding of the canoe as well. But what I'm hoping to do is to present a bit more information than we've had about it before. So a 1925 Belfast Telegraph article by Robert Welsh, the photographer, publicising the development of the new Belfast Museum and Art Gallery on Stranmillis Road, featured this photo. And in that article, Welsh stated, "The first of the exhibits to be housed in the new building may be seen the Great War Canoe captured from a raiding party by Captain Casement RN and brought home in one piece, not cut in two as usual for ease of carrying. It is the finest war canoe in Europe." And this paper is the result of a sustained study of the highly significant canoe, covering all of the museum institutions in which the collection of which its part has resided, and seeking to use the canoe as a case study to begin to examine how, by a roundabout route, the activism of Roger Casement impacted on the collection. The paper is embedded in a new overview of the display and interpretation of what is now the World Cultures Collection in National Museums NI within the period 1831 to 1929, and surrounding which I hope to help to generate new understandings. Focusing on the period leading up to and following the opening of the Belfast Museum and Art Gallery and Botanic Gardens, the paper shows how, although the new museum that opened in 1929 marked an important shift in the public understanding of Northern Ireland's history, it did not immediately correspond with an advancement in attitudes to the importance of ethnographic collections or of the people they represented. Rather, coming as it did after the establishment of Northern Ireland, this was a turning point when the organisation began to focus on more local priorities. The 2022 display of the canoe in the Inclusive Global Histories exhibition, which is on at the moment, is part of a planned engagement with Indigenous communities and with diverse local groups, exploring the legacies of colonialism while also addressing an old dilemma concerning gallery space. I'm hoping, therefore, that this paper is a timely intervention, providing a basis for future work on the canoe's biography. And to revisit some things about which it's not scrolling. Thank you. Many of you will know, understanding the history of the ethnographic holdings in general and of the Solomon Islands canoe in particular depends on BNHPS, but Belfast Natural History and Philosophical Society and other learned society records in public collections and archives, and on the National Museums NI photographic collection and historical newspapers. By drawing afresh on these primary sources, I'm seeking to address gaps in the publication of a collection on which previous authors have been few. The most prolific of these, and arguably the first, was Winifred Glover, the Ulster Museum's curator of ethnography from 1978 to 2009. My research draws on her exhibition catalogues, articles, chapters, and unpublished correspondence, and on interviews and associated communications with her. Further sources include the widely known but slim volume by Noel Nesbitt from 1979 on the history of the Ulster Museum overall, within which references to the ethnographic collection are scant, and Jonathan Jeffrey Wright's chapter on the collection's founding institution, the society to which I've referred. The collection is increasingly understood to be highly culturally precious, and as Winifred Glover identified, some items are extremely rare. But since its arrival in Belfast in 1898, the history of the canoe, among the most unique of the items and certainly the largest, has been elusive. In order to understand the history of the canoe in Belfast, it's necessary first to understand that of the collection of which it's part. And as I've said, you all know already, the World Cultures Collection began with the founding in 1821 of the Belfast Natural History Society, which between 1831 and 1909 ran the Belfast Museum on College Square North. The ethnographic items in the Society's collection came from its appeal to its networks of travellers, merchants, officers of the Army and Navy to assist in securing specimens to stock the museum. And that quote is taken from Nesbitt. Jonathan Wright's analysis of how the Society's displays were conceived and arranged does much to make up for an absence of surviving interior photos. In short, this was a practice of representing global others, inextricably bound up with the expansion and exercise of imperial power. Thank you. The second founding collection was the Town Council's Belfast Public Museum, also known as the Belfast Municipal Art Gallery and Museum, which opened in 1888 on Royal Avenue within the same building as the new Belfast Public Library, now the Belfast Central Library. And it was here that the corporation set out to exhibit, to quote, the manufactures of foreign countries, thereby bringing before the eye of the work of the artisans of other countries and stimulating the industries of our own. The museum's displays focus on assemblages particular to donors' interests, including, for example, the Reverend Canon John Granger's natural, historical, archaeological and ethnographic items that he gave in 1891, and in 1919 from Thomas Edens Osborne, the largest collection known, quotes, of bicycles. In 1909, the engineer John Horner gave his large collection of spinning wheels, ranging from, quotes, the primitive machines of India to the most elaborate kinds in use in Europe today. And this collection was frequently referenced in the museum displays and publications up to and beyond 1929. This account of John Horner's spinning wheel suggests the evolutionary perspective with which the museum regarded the work of other cultures and was in line with widespread museum practice at the time. As Raymond Corby and many others have shown, display practices in both metropolitan and regional British museums ranked the products of colonised cultures according to their positioning on a racist evolutionary spectrum imagined by Western scientists that was intended to place both the products of the rural and working classes and also those of colonised regions at a disadvantage. When in 1909, the Belfast Natural History and Philosophical Society decided to transfer its collection to public ownership, the offer was contingent on the corporation's undertaking to house the collection in a new museum. And the corporation's primary negotiator for these arrangements was Arthur Dean, born in 1875, died in 1954, the Municipal Museum's curator from 1907 to 1942. Dean would become a long-standing honorary secretary of the Society and its president and biographer, and it's from him that much of our knowledge about the first century of the Society and of the Belfast Museum comes. It was he who in 1910 recruited a new assistant curator, J.A.S. Stendhal, Sidney Stendhal, to begin compiling a catalogue of the amalgamated collections. And it was Dean who as curator stewarded the move of the Belfast Municipal Art Gallery and Museum on Royal Avenue, the Belfast Museum and Art Gallery and Botanic Gardens. He oversaw the planning and fitting out of that building and was the most senior staff member upon its eventual opening in 1929. Given then that a grasp of Dean's worldview might be pivotal to understanding how, at these critical points in the institution's history, the ethnographic collections were conceived and understood, it's frustrating that he left so little first-hand testimony to the public record. Only 2 letters in Briony, one of them covered in soot, suggesting a bonfire was made of the rest. We know, though, from newspaper articles penned by Dean, that he compared prehistoric Britain and Ireland with contemporary practices on the other side of the world. He writes in 1930, for example, that the new museum records the customs and habits of our ancestors, as well as the customs of races in all corners of the earth. It was Dean who published the first lists of accessions and in the earliest in 1906. He lists under the division of ethnography a sansa or thumb piano from Congo and a stringed instrument from Lagos, alongside other items grouped as Irish religion and antiquities. From this point on, he's counting his annual ethnographic acquisitions in numbers of up to a few hundreds, and is segmenting ethnology and antiquities as a separate division alongside art, natural history, and the local collections. Arthur Dean commissioned the first surviving photographs of the museum's displays. One taken by Robert Welsh. As you probably know, Robert Welsh was primarily a photographer by occupation, but a conchologist by passion. But he also was evidently very interested in the ethnographic displays, and this is why I think he photographed them, and why the very few photographs that survive from that period are of ethnographic displays. So this photograph taken by Robert Welsh, I've dated to 1925 and shows cases of oceanic, African and Asian items typologically displayed in broad geographical ranges. Although the 2 museums' collections had begun to be combined on paper in 1910, it appears from the absence of mention of ethnographic displays in Dean's annual reports or quarterly notes up until 1925 that none were ready until then. This was for 3 reasons, I think. Firstly, as shown in his annual reports, progress on cataloguing the ethnographic items in the Society's collection had been slow. Secondly, as Dean acknowledged in his 1922 report, the BNHPS collections were not moved out of the College Square building for almost a decade and a half after they'd been donated. Finally, there was another object taking up the space into which, in the photo above, the ethnographic collections had been moved, and this was the Solomon Islands canoe, which was taken to the new Belfast Museum and Art Gallery in Botanic Gardens in July 1925. Before moving to discuss why the canoe was displayed as it was, it's necessary first to re-emphasise the importance in the Belfast Municipal Museum, the earlier institution, of the idea of cultural evolution. As Tony Bennett argues, in 19th century museums in Britain, the distant past and the anthropological present were conflated as pasts beyond memory, and visitors to both the Municipal Museum and the new Belfast Museum and Art Gallery that would become the Ulster Museum received similar lessons in atemporality. The impressive housing for the collections made space for the display of ethnographic collections, but did not yet correspond with new ways of thinking about them. And as Dean made clear in a 1929 account of the new museum, he set ethnographic items between Irish antiquities and applied art. In both of these displays, the Edens Osborne collection of bicycles was displayed on the top of the cases, ranging, quote, from bone shaker up to modern types. And that re-emphasises how both the applied arts and the ethnographic collections were interpreted in an evolutionary perspective through that comparison. Through his membership of the BNHPS, Dean had been exposed to eugenicist discussions, and he was himself a cultural evolutionist, writing in 1924 that, quotes, Ireland is noted for the material remains of successive races. In this French Paleolithic art, there was no attempt at grouping or composition to form what we now call a picture, such as we find in the drawings of the South African Bushmen. But Arthur Dean was a botanist rather than a natural historian by background, and it's therefore likely that the museum's natural history displays, most notably man living races, are distinguished from former Homo sapiens with a particularly white skull at the apex. It's likely that the curator for this case was, at least partially, his assistant curator, Sidney Stendhal. Stendhal knew the ethnographic collections well, having been recruited by Dean to catalogue them in 1910. That the Ascent of Man case might have been his production is suggested also by the friendship between the curator Stendhal and the case's photographer Robert Welsh. When Welsh died in 1936, Stendhal was one of 3 executors to the will that would ensure the transfer of his photographic collection to the Belfast Naturalists Field Club and subsequently gifted to the Belfast Museum and Art Gallery. The responsibility for providing guided tours to the case was Stendhal's, and he writes in greater detail than Dean about it, stating that there is a series of British mammals and ancestry cases dealing with the elephant, horse and man, the last being graphically illustrated by an ancestral tree with skulls of various cultures correlated with types of implements connected with each culture. Between June and September 1930, a rumbling controversy connected with the Ascent of Man's case's integrity threatened the integrity of the case when the Belfast branch of the British Israel World Federation raised concerns later championed by Alderman Robert Pearce that the exhibit, quotes, shows man's development from the lower animals and thus discredits the Bible itself. Persuaded by Dean that its removal would, quotes, result in a futile attempt to sidetrack Belfast progress and leave us open to ridicule in the scientific journals of the United Kingdom and the rest of the world, the Libraries, Museums and Art Committee determined that the case should remain intact. Dean must therefore have been supporting Stendhal's interpretation, resisting conservative local pressure in defence of the museum's scientific credentials. From this, it's apparent that the attitudes of the 2 leaders of the museum, Dean and Stendhal, to the ethnographic holdings, coming as they did from other, quotes, living races, were at the least hegemonic. The moment when they take the Solomon Islands canoe out of the gallery, coinciding in the Belfast Municipal Museum, coinciding with the appearance of Roger Casement's name in the newspapers in 1915, distills the dilemma about how to frame imperialism far away while avoiding its political implications at home. And that dilemma is still, I think, being played out through the Inclusive Global Histories exhibition and associated communications. When I first visited the canoe for this research in 2015 as part of my PhD, it was walled in to make space for temporary exhibitions. As correspondence with current staff testifies, this was not due to any lack of appreciation for its importance, but rather because the space was needed for other things. Now, with the museum decolonization movement, the canoe is coming to the fore once more, and in the 1922 exhibition Inclusive Global Histories that I've just mentioned, it's been revealed again for all to see. But the question remains, how had it come to be hidden at all? Can you scroll on, please? The Belfast canoe was taken from the Solomons by Lieutenant, later Rear Admiral John Casement, the Royal Navy commander of the HMS Rapid that was stationed in Australia from 1895. And as my colleague in Sweden, Aoife O'Brien, shows, after the establishment of the British Solomon Islands Protectorate in 1893, Charles Morris Woodford, an amateur naturalist and first resident commissioner to the Solomons, together with Arthur Mahaffey, the first district officer of the region, collected canoes in order to disrupt cosmological beliefs and confront traditional practices. Collecting was, in Mahaffey's case, a means of pursuing a prolific hobby, and for Woodford, it was also a means of amassing social capital in the metropole. Woodford and Casement certainly knew each other, for Woodford travelled on HMS Rapid on an anti-headhunting raid, possibly the one that resulted in the theft of the canoe in 1897. It can be surmised that for Casement, the donation of the item to the Belfast Museum was, as for Woodford and Mahaffey, Mahaffey's very large collection is in the National Museum of Ireland, was a lasting means of securing Casement's reputation in Ireland. The curator, Charles Elcock, recorded in the museum's stockbook that the canoe was fighting in a headhunting cannibal expedition in 1896, although Winifred Glover later suggests, based on the Rapids log, that it may have been captured on the 10th of August 1897. It's still uncertain from which island the canoe comes. Can you go back one slide? After his death, Casement's widow, Maria Young, gave the museum a canoe prow ornament. And because the ornament's on exhibition at the moment in the Inclusive Global Histories exhibition, the ornament is associated with the island of Choiseul. And for that reason, in 1994, Glover published the canoe as having derived from that island. Her later correspondence, however, with the ethnographer and diplomat Rhys Richards suggests based on the fact that Mabili was the last stop recorded on the log of the rapid on its routes between the islands of Gavutu and Nugatoki. You can see that route there. In 1897, Rhys Richards then, because of this, suggests that Casement took the canoe in Mabili, to which it went on, and that for stylistic reasons, the people of Mabili may have captured it on a raid of Morovo. So obviously this is a bit of research that needs to happen in the Solomon Islands to identify exactly where it's from. The art historian Deborah Waite has, by contrast, associated the canoe with another nearby island, Roviana. And when Casement's posting to the Australia station was relieved in October 1897, he sailed to Devonport, arriving on the 25th of March 1898. And if you look up the HMS Rapid on Wikipedia, you'll find an image of the ship of that date, and it appears to me it's a very what do you call it? What's that word? When it's all broken, it's a very broken up image. But it looks to me as though there is a canoe attached to the side of the HMS Rapid, although that photo is dated 1888. So that's obviously a previous headhunting trophy being exported back to Britain or another country. The first documentary sighting of the canoe in Belfast isn't actually Elcock's 1898 entry, but his diary entry of that same day on the 4th of April. And in that he writes, "War canoe presented by Captain Casement per the John Young, delivered this PM, considerably damaged in a storm en voyage." And John Young was High Sheriff of Antrim, the resident of Galgorm Castle, and John Casement's father-in-law. An annotation that appears to be in Elcock's handwriting but is undated claims again the canoe was damaged by storms en route and the broken parts were stitched together after arrival here, the stitches being mainly covered with putty. The places of the missing pieces of pearl were painted in white so as to clearly distinguish our work from that of the natives. Nearly 1,000 pieces were missing. And thank you again to National Museums NI for giving access to its stock book, Elcock stock book. On the 20th to the 25th of May in 1898, Elcock records that there is, quotes, man, Bob, mending the canoe. Elcock loses no time in putting it on display. By September, he's fixing a railing around it. And after this, he appears to forget all about it because it's not mentioned in any of the remainder of his surviving diaries. And the records left by his successors are likewise sparse. The earliest photograph, I just want to quickly, this is a quick digression. Also in 1898, Elcock records acquiring a dugout canoe, which has been found in Portadown as part of the excavations for the new double-track railway. The fact that it was for the excavations of double-track railway is my interpretation, but I think that's what's going on because he's getting it from a company of engineers. And that's significant because if you scroll one more on, the canoe is ever afterwards until recently displayed with the dugout canoes, a dugout canoe and then another dugout canoe underneath. And in Elcock's diary, you can see a little sketch where he's sketching this mount to put the stands to put the canoe on. And that is revealing as well of how the canoe is understood. He's placing the prehistoric Irish with the very recent Solomon Islands and comparing the state of advancement of the two cultures. So the earliest surviving photograph of the canoe is one I've dated to 1908, also by Robert Welsh. And this shows it against a backdrop of reproduction marbles, below which stands a glass solarium, apparently containing live plants. The juxtaposition is particularly uncomfortable because suspended below the sloping glass ceiling on the top floor of the Belfast Public Museum, which is now part of the Belfast Central Library, the details surrounding the canoe have been bleached out for postcard, giving it to a contemporary eye an atmosphere of isolation. Two individuals appear in the photograph holding a white sheet to form a blank canvas for the postcard. One is a ghostly presence whose only legs, if you can see just on the right-hand side, he's standing on a chair, can be seen. And that's, I think, possibly Welsh's assistant, William Alfred Green, who later became an important photographer in his own right. At this stage, Greene is an apprentice to Welsh. He worked for him between 1905 and 1910. At the other end of the sheet stands a blurred figure with a sloping forehead and small chin, and I think that could be Dean himself based on a comparison with the portrait of him in Nesbitt's book. You go one on then. Thank you. On the postcard of the canoe, it's described as war canoe, length 40 feet from the Solomon Islands, took part in a cannibal expedition in 1896, made of planks chopped into shape by stone hatchets and fixed together by split rattan, inlaid with peak, I think I've mistyped that, inlaid with something or other, and decorated with poached egg shells, ovula ovum, and bone pendants, similar in form at both ends. And I think the interpretation is quite interesting because he's likening the shells to poached egg, which is a very rustic kind of low image, and then he's using the ovula ovum to emphasize his own scientific credentials. The typeface on the reverse of the postcard allows us to posit a date for the label that is still adhered to the canoe. This records similar information, although the canoe has been shortened by a foot to 39 feet. And I suspect that's because further damage occurs to the canoe while it's in the building of the museum. But with the addition on the label that the donor of the canoe was Captain Casement RN, and this is important because his name doesn't really last. It flitters in and out of records from that point onwards. The progression between the Welsh and Greene photos, this is a Greene photo, so taken obviously after 1910, by which time Greene had set up his own studio, pictorialised the canoe in the process of being reframed from being an isolated oddity that cannot compare with Western art in the 1908 image by Welsh for the postcard, to being situated amongst Granger's antiquities and Horner's spinning wheels in a visual reminder. If you go on one, you can see the spinning wheels. These are obviously contemporaneous, these two photographs. In a visual reminder to viewers that it must be considered as representing a primitive culture and an evolutionary perspective. Through these photos, the Belfast Municipal Museum and Art Gallery is showing its beginnings as an active generator of ideas about the other. The movement of the canoe from the Municipal Museum to the Belfast Museum and Art Gallery was another deliberate reframing. You can move on one. So this is back again to 1925 in the image that we saw at the start. Made possible by the fact that, as Winifred Glover later reported, the boat room, what had become popularly dubbed the boat room amongst staff, was built around the canoe. Two images show the canoe in the gallery when it is under construction, and in the first, this one taken in 1925, the room lacks plaster, flooring and windows. In a 1928 image, these have been added, and glass cases still unfilled have been put in place. Later, go on to the next one in the sequence. Hopefully. Sorry. Thank you. So later the canoe is seen surrounded by ethnographic material, and I think this probably dates to 1929 when the museum was opened. And later still, I think this one is probably about 1939. The canoe remains, but the other ethnographic collections have been removed in favour of an RIC uniform, archaeological, axes and Irish harps. So the reason why this progression happens, I think, can be explained within the context of what was going on around the Casement name back in 1915. To go on a little to, so what's happening in this image here? This photograph was taken in 1925 when the canoe was removed from the Belfast Municipal Museum to the Belfast Museum and Art Gallery in Botanic Gardens. And this shows that the canoe has been replaced by natural history displays, and I'll come on to that in a minute. So from Ballycastle, John Casement RN was a half cousin to Roger Casement, a captain of the King's Own Regiments. Near Ballymena, this Roger was father to the better known Roger David Casement, the Irish revolutionary leader. But although he was more directly connected in terms of being a half first cousin to Roger Casement's father, he was actually Roger the Younger's contemporary. They were more close in age, and they would have known each other given that Roger the Younger was a regular visitor to Galgorm. As is widely known, following service as a British consul in French Congo, I hardly even need to read this paragraph because I know you all know it, Roger the Younger authored a report on abuses of indigenous peoples perpetrated under Leopold II, King of Belgium. And later again, as a consul, he investigated slavery and violent exploitation on rubber plantations in Brazil, Peru and Colombia. It was for his subsequent report provoking activism and anti-slavery campaigns in Britain that Casement was awarded the knighthood, of which he was stripped when in Dublin he was convicted for treason, following which he was executed in Pentonville in 1916. Despite the fact that the boat room, though, had been built around it, in 1925 the canoe is not mentioned. Had been built around it in 1925. The canoe is not mentioned in the 1909 to 1922 plans that Dean had overseen the development of for the new museum. The canoe isn't mentioned anywhere as a central exhibit. And there's no direct record from either Dean or Stendhal, who was his successor as director of the museum, to show what they thought about it. It's highly suggestive, though, that in Dean's autumn 1915 quarterly report, he writes on the 11th of September, his first ever foreword. So he hasn't written a foreword to the quarterly report before. And in that, he goes into an excursion on the importance of birds' eggs for educating children, which is exactly what's happening here in this photograph. And then states, almost as an addendum at the end of the foreword, it is hoped that now more space is available in the Granger Room by the removal of the long Solomon Island canoe to arrange similar exhibits of natural history. In that year's report, so the annual report, Dean noted on behalf of the Art Gallery and Museum Committee that owing to the crowded condition of the very limited amount of available exhibition space, it had decided to erect a shed at the rear of the building to store the long Solomon Island canoe and some other large objects which occupied a good deal of floor space. By this means, it's been possible to make a much needed rearrangement of some of the exhibits, which has been appreciated by the visitors. It's unlikely to be a coincidence, I think, that at exactly this time in the Belfast papers, Roger Casement's name was hotting up. Just 2 weeks previously, before the 11th of September, foreword was written, Casement had been reported as having sought to raise an Irish brigade in support of Germany. And from the 1925 account of the removal of the canoe from the gallery, it's clear that it was moved back at some point after 1915. It comes back into the gallery before being removed again to the Belfast Museum. So it's an overstatement to claim then that John Casement's association with the canoe was covered up after 1915, but certainly 1915 was a moment when the Casement canoe, the John Casement canoe, was moved into a shed at the back of the building. His name, Casement's name on Dean's 1908 label remained stuck to the canoe. It's still there now. And it reappeared, Casement's name reappeared again when in 1925 Welsh's Belfast Telegraph article mentioning the canoe's importance was celebrating its installation in the new museum. Casement's name was never erased from the stock book. And this is what allowed it to be remembered by Winifred Glover in the mid-20th century in her exhibitions and publications. But even so, given its impressive size, its centrality to the history of the Boat Room Gallery, and the apparently dramatic story surrounding his capture of it, it's noticeable that the Casement connection has never been developed as part of its interpretation. The new museum was first conceived in 1909, but the laying of the foundation stone was delayed until 1924 due to the Easter Rising, the First World War and the Irish Civil War. So the coming to fruition of Dean's Belfast Museum and Art Gallery building project coincided not only with the war, but also with the Rising and the establishment of Northern Ireland. And this changed forever, in my view, how ethnographic items connected with the British Empire, of which the canoe was amongst the foremost objects, would be exhibited. Given that the Rising, in which Roger Casement was an agitator, had been an anti-imperial war, and that the canoe had been given by his cousin John Casement in celebration of empire, it's highly likely that the canoe presented an interpretive conundrum. Instead of emphasising the Casement connection, the museum's references to it appear to have been weaker over time. Beyond Winifred Glover's publications, I've as yet found no labels interpreting it for that long period from 1929 up until 2009. In fact, well, she has some catalogue entries for it in the 1980s that I've already covered. But by 2009, when the museum reopens after a major refurbishment, the Ulster Museum, the canoe by this time is explained in only generic terms. So the label from that period says the Solomon Islanders practiced head hunting as part of their religious customs. They considered the head to be the most sacred part of the body, with those of their enemies having particular power. Head hunts took place during times of celebration such as marriages and the all-important yam harvest. Special canoe houses were erected to protect canoes when not in use. So all very useful information providing cultural context for the canoe, but not actually interpreting the canoe itself and its own history and that of its collector. So in conclusion then, as I hope to have demonstrated, while it's been in Belfast, there has been uncertainty about what the canoe signifies, or rather what it should signify to local audiences. And this was for two primary reasons. On the one hand, the focus of the institution has never been particularly on ethnographic collections. Secondly, and despite Welsh's description of it as the finest war canoe in Europe, its prestige fell in Northern Ireland when the name of its collector did. National Museums NI has botanical specimens that Roger Casement collected in Congo and donated to the Belfast Museum, and displays Casement's camera thought to have been used by him to capture these activities. It also displays the spectacles he wore in Pentonville prison where he was hanged, and propaganda medals issued in Germany after his execution, with a framed memo written in pencil noting a pilgrimage walk to take place on the 4th of August 1916, the day after he was, inverted commas, cruelly murdered. In remembering 1916, the exhibition staged as part of the Ulster Museum's contribution to the Living Legacies programme, this pamphlet was displayed alongside a contemporary booklet on Dublin and the Sinn Féin Rising. So the tension between Roger's anti-imperial activity while a British diplomat in Congo and South America and his revolutionary stance in Ireland has been extensively explored within the institution. How interesting it would be then to explore this history in the light of the British colonial expansion and disruption of cultural practices alongside the theft of the canoe that was happening in his wider family circle. Within the context of National Museums NI's current decolonisation programme, the time is right to do so from an Indigenous perspective. As stated above, the Irish story of the canoe has been little explored, and this is what I've been trying to do here. I don't think of myself as somebody that can interpret the Solomon Islands context, but I think what we can do on this side of the equation is to look at local records. So that's all. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening.
Thank you very much, Briony, for that fascinating presentation. Kind of digging into the archaeology of kind of museum collections and the specific item within them here in Belfast. We've got time for questions, and we have people both in the room and online, so we can take questions from either group. So if you're online and want to ask a question, if you can press the little hand icon and then unmute yourself. But anyone want to start in the room? Yes, Daniel.
Thank you very much for that paper. I appreciate it. I've been in Leeds myself for just over 20 years and visited the museum many times. It's nice to see the collections being explored in this way, the provenance of this particular object discussed in this way. So congratulations and thanks very much for that. I just want to pick up on a very small point there. You mentioned an acquisition of the spinning wheel from India, which I haven't seen, but I was wondering a couple of things around that object and its acquisition. I was wondering whether that, in ethnographic terms, whether that kind of item would resonate with the linen culture, spinning culture in Ireland. Is there any kind of ethnographic connection being seen there.
Mm.
And secondly, in terms of that temporal kind of framework you suggested, where the island itself and some of its, particularly its rural, culture, was also seen as, in some ways, representative of antiquity or primitive in those terms within quotes, a primitive culture too. And to what extent do you think these kinds of things were going on, and itself being in those terms?
So the Indian spinning wheel is mentioned as one of the collection of spinning wheels which come from all over the world, and the collection was put together by John Horner, who was a kind of protagonist in the Belfast Natural History and Philosophical Society as well, having connections with the kind of municipal authorities and with the Belfast Municipal Museum. And Horner was, as an engineer, was interested in the kind of evolutionary development of spinning wheels, and was obviously influential within the organisation because his name is repeated over and over again through the annual reports right up until after 1929. But it's important as well to note that John Horner was one of the leaders of the Belfast Industrial Exhibition. I'm trying to remember the name now, the date now. I think it was around, I'd have to look it up, but there was an industrial exhibition it could have been 1896. And he was one of the leaders of that, and it was divided into sections, one of which was around kind of mechanical objects, and he led the development of that alongside Viscount Pirrie, the chairman of Harland and Wolff, or the shipbuilding company. I don't know exactly what Harland and Wolff was called at the time. And of course, industrial exhibitions very much shaped and were reframed then. The attitude of industrial exhibitions, what was being presented there, was reshaped for museum consumption and was tied up with the tradition of great exhibitions and fairs across the world that was happening at the time. It is very well established as having kind of imperial representation within it.
So would that mean then that Ireland's spinning and weaving industry was seen as something that was advanced, therefore the machinery and everything else that went along with that development?
I think it was
shows how advanced now Ireland is. Is that
exactly? So it's being done, that 1896 industrial exhibition is actually framed as happening because there's a decline in the linen industry in the centre of the city. So it's the exhibition takes place around the linen hall, the White Linen Hall, which then was replaced by the Belfast City Hall. Earlier, in 1912, the City Hall's built, and so it's being put on as a way of boosting the local manufacture that's happening in Belfast. And the spinning wheels are kind of represented as part of folk culture, so they're looking backwards, in contrast to the kind of industrialization that's happening in Belfast at the time.
And the Indian spinning wheel itself would be then before Gandhi's popularization of the image, in the 20s probably. Would that be right then?
Yes.
Because
yeah. Well, this collection is,
because in some ways Gandhi was sort of asking the spinning wheel to take India back against the colonial culture, which had the industry of cloth making and so on. The cotton being taken out of India, spun in the mills of Manchester, then in India. He was saying, let's just go back to our own simple spinning wheel.
That's a really interesting angle on it, but I hadn't thought about. I don't know whether Horner was aware of what was happening. How the spinning wheel was being revisited elsewhere in the world, but his attitude was certainly one that it was part of the past that was being left behind.
Late 19th century.
Sorry, the spinning wheel collection. I'm remembering that. The spinning wheel collection was given by Horner in 1909, but Horner himself had been involved in the industrial exhibition and society and the municipal museum in the 1890s.
Sean?
Sorry, just before I ask my question, coming very quickly from the point I was raising, I think, I think it's a totally different context. The Irish thing
Okay.
is part of a Whiggish narrative of the superior economic development of Ulster. The arrival of Protestant immigrants and Huguenots in the 17th century bring with them spinning and they lift Ulster out of dismal rural poverty that afflicts the rest of Ireland. So it's a Whiggish narrative of progress. And if you want to see it visually, go down to City Hall and look at John Luke's great mural. It's Arthur Chichester reading the Charter of Belfast. And totally anachronistically, somebody's building a wooden ship.
Yeah.
And there's also a spinning wheel.
Yeah.
And this is part of Belfast is different to the rest of Ireland because of spinning.
Yeah.
And okay, the spinning wheel, the hand spinning wheel is primitive by the standards of the late 19th century, but it's the beginning of great things. So I think that would be the context there.
Yeah.
And the question I want to ask is about, I mean, on the fascinating paper, you were talking about the way in which they fit this canoe into a notion of a cultural and ethnographic hierarchy, and a racial hierarchy to some extent. And you've got this Southern man's canoe and a prehistoric Irish dugout canoe beneath. Now, I wonder how far do you have to factor into that analysis the canoe itself, the way it's being identified very much as a headhunting canoe. It's not just this is being a seagoing vessel. It's formed of a private practice, which is explicitly linked to a primitive religion of headhunting. So, I mean, there's two things there. One is, it's easier to present that notion of cultural inferiority if you can do something, have somebody as graphic as headhunting. And was it only used for headhunting? Or was this also a way in which a reasonably sophisticated maritime culture got around from one island to another?
And that's a really interesting question, which I haven't got to the bottom of. I mean, this is where the research needs to happen in the Solomon Islands, I think, because it's always claimed to be a headhunting canoe, and it's repeatedly claimed right up until the 18th, into, as you saw, 2009. But that canoe has never been directly associated with a specific headhunting expedition. There is no direct evidence that that was the case. We only know that this campaign was happening in the Western Pacific in order to disrupt headhunting, and heirlooms were stolen as a result and sold all over Europe. I should have said that this canoe is really critically important because it's almost completely unique as far as I can see. There are other examples of Solomon Islands canoe, and the best known of which is in the British Museum. But the British Museum example, it dates to 1910 and was commissioned by a colonial district officer, Broadhurst Hill. And so this canoe is, if you think of, the debate around what's authentic and what isn't, in museums, this can be thought of as a kind of an authentic item that wasn't produced as a result of colonialism, but its capture was the product of imperialism.
Good. Yeah, Sophie?
It's reading about the ascent of man, approaching the debates around that. It reminded me of, I think, at the Giant's Causeway, they had to have a creationist retelling to soothe local concerns. And I was just wondering how this time they kind of countered that. Was there a kind of public campaign, or did they just say you're wrong?
There was it's all over the papers in that period between August and October 1930, and it is, in the kind of the Northern Whig, there's endless commentary about, going backwards and forwards about whether the thing should be removed or not. And from that point of view, I suppose Dean and Stendhal can be thought of as having been courageous in defending the scientific principles of the institution against really conservative local pressure, including the engagement with the heated debate around the alderman Pearce, his name was. But nonetheless, they are clearly identifying living races in an evolutionary perspective. And what I've tried to do here is dig into a bit more of the characters that produced that case and why they might have been thinking in that way. Stendhal was friends with Wilfred Jackson, who was an Egyptologist and is quite well known about, and he had just come back he chaired a conversation with him later on, a conversazione with him at the Belfast Society, in which Wilfred Jackson was talking about, kind of the evolution of man and so on. So I think it's likely that it was Stendhal, but Stendhal was primarily an ornithologist. He was more of a natural historian than Dean was. But what he was really doing was trying to say, look, we know we have these scientific principles that can challenge, can be part of this. We're no longer just a regional museum. We're a city museum, and therefore we're developing these scientific displays.
Mouth.
Have there been discussions about the repatriation of the canoe, or any of the other items in the collection, ethnographic items?
Well, some items have been quite recently. Some Hawaiian heads were repatriated by the National Museum's NI that had been taken by Gordon Thompson, who was an early society collector and quite problematic from a contemporary perspective. But the repatriation debate isn't one that I directly engage in. I don't work for the museum, and it's a very can be very politicized and sensitive, and it's not something that I really engage with. So I don't know whether the subject of the Solomon Islands canoe repatriation has been discussed at all. There has been a revival of these canoes in the last 30 years or so, with fleets being rebuilt and so on.
Okay. Did we have a question from someone who's joining us online? Did I see a hand go up? Just unmute yourself and ask your question if you want to. No, maybe not. Okay, so I have a question. So the next major kind of reconstitution of the space of the museum after the new buildings opened in 1929 was the opening of the new Brutalist wing, was it 1971? And obviously the renaming of it was the Ulster Museum. So there's a lot more space created within the museum building, and I think the ethnographic collection has moved into the new building at that point, into the extension.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
But is there any reinterpret? Because obviously there's a lot happening in terms of decolonization at that point, and the context of the interpretation of ethnographic collections. Is that reflected in the way the canoe is represented?
So the canoe is never really. I mean, Winifred Glover does a lot to look at the kind of records of the HMS Rapid and to try and get more understanding of its context. But partly as a result of the fact that it was only recently the photographs have been digitized, it's been really difficult to trace that kind of sequential progression. And the photographs seem to completely stop, at least the publicly available photographs completely stop in sort of 1939.
Okay.
But I think it is important to note the kind of the broader context of what was happening in the mid 20th century, when Winifred Glover started work there in 1967, first as secretary to Lawrence Flanagan, and then became the collections curator in 1978. So from 1967 onwards, she was gradually trying to bring the ethnographic collection to light. But she speaks about how it was constantly, it never had its own budget as a collection, and it was constantly fighting against other priorities, particularly Irish archaeology and art. And that she had continually to defend the position of the canoe in the gallery. And interestingly, the redevelopment that you were talking about, something dropped on the canoe at that time from a ladder. And she records this in her publications, that it was very carefully repaired again. So when in 2009 the museum is rebuilt again, there is a move to move the canoe out, and she says, no, you can't move it out because it's too fragile. It's the whole building was built around the canoe in the first place, but also having had this further damage, it's too fragile to move now. And that's why it's still there, and that's why it's walled in favour of these local Belfast photographic exhibitions and stuff in 2009.
Can I ask you, just on the back of that, does that mean if, say, some medical institute and someone around said, can we have our canoe back? There might just be quite a problem of getting it out.
It'd be a problem to get it out.
Yeah.
You would have to cut it up.
Another question. Many fascinating aspects of your paper this afternoon. That exhibition space in was currently the central library, does that still exist with the glass atriums?
That's my next thing. I really want to go up to the top floor and see if we can get into that, if I can get into that room. Isn't it a reading room or something on the top floor? Local studies room?
Yeah.
So I want to get into that top floor and get a better sense of how it was laid out. Because it was,
you're always conscious of the fact that these institutions have so many exhibits they could actually put out on display, because I know we have very limited space.
Yeah.
That strikes me. It's a bit like public record office
Mm.
with the
Balmoral Avenue.
yeah. No, the current one.
Oh,
the
right.
Titanic Quarter.
Yeah.
To me, it's almost sort of an ideal gallery space because of the light
Yeah.
that you have there.
Mhm.
I think they have a collection themselves, so portraits from back to the last image.
Yeah.
Exhibited.
Yes, yeah. And in fact, the earlier photographs, sorry, Cormac, the earliest photographs, the kind of 1930s and 1920s photographs show that wonderful light of the gallery, which then with the 1960s and early 70s redeveloped is closed off. It becomes much darker. Whereas it was intended to, at one stage I thought perhaps because the gallery had been designed around it, it was intended to be displayed as a diorama with kind of, you know, figures, as was popular at the time, but there's no evidence for that at all. So what happened, I think that might also be part of the story of, you know, what happened after 1929 in the new Northern Ireland.
Yeah, it's very reminiscent of the drawing office at Titanic, or you know the Harlem World.
Yeah, the light, yeah.
And headquarters offices with that quality of light, you know, don't need any artificial.
Yeah,
processes.
yeah.
Acknowledge the temporary very interesting you have to very comprehensive way with the question of the Casement involved in the canoe. But today in the gallery, what do you think the canoe says about our relationship with Indigenous people? What does that canoe say in that gallery in terms of the display today?
Mm. I mean, it's wonderful that it has been redisplayed because it had been closed off for a decade or so. And I think that the National Museum's NI speaks about the Inclusive Global Histories exhibition as part of a process and part of opening up conversations. And for that reason, it's got a structure which is the three cases of items that aren't the canoe in it go, depending on which end of the gallery you start at, they go past, present, future, or future, present, past. So it can be read either way, which I think is very clever, and it explicitly is looking at, you know, problems of historic collections, and then it's talking about contemporary racism, and in the present case, and then the future case is talking about, you know, future collaborations and so on, and conversations about restitution or collaborative reinterpretation, and that structure is very clever. Against that context, the canoe is still slightly sitting in isolation. It doesn't have a past, present, future dimension yet. It has a kind of a past dimension which relates to it having been recorded as a headhunting canoe in 1898. But yet it sits in the middle of the gallery of ethnographic items. I think it's wonderful that it's returned to being, you know, it's returned to being central to an exhibition again. But because the gallery was built around it, it still has a slightly uneasy position and it can't be displayed in context. And I think that in itself is problematic.
Eamon?
Following on that, one of them, the photograph I think really caught my eye, you know, with the changing environment in which the canoe is being displayed, was the one that had the RI. I mean, I'm very glad you identified the RIC uniform, because I really quite believe I was looking at in that photograph. But I mean, part of the history that you're talking about is a history of something which has become a fixture. Often a slightly embarrassing one, is, you know, the exhibitions around it changed, and it was in context. Now, I mean, I suppose the question then is that, I mean, it comes to Belfast because of the Casement connection. But was there a sort of purpose to having it here? Did people think this is what we'll do with it, or was it just acquisitiveness that actually? I
really don't know, and I'd love to know more about the Casement kind of side of the equation, and also how long it had been in Galgorm before John Young gave it, and what was happening to it in Galgorm. Was it just in a way? Did he just want it out of the way, and therefore he decided to give it to the Belfast Museum? I can't find. There is a Robert Young who's very closely involved with the society and the Belfast Municipal Museum, but I haven't found a connection between him and the Galgorm Youngs yet. So what was the relationship between Young and the museum that it ended up there? Did he just give it to the nearest museum that could take it, or what? I don't know. I mean, the Casements are lending. So there's an exhibition of missionary material around that period in Ballymena. And the Casement family lends kind of African items to it. So they clearly have a load of stuff in Galgorm. Or not Galgorm, where do they live outside Ballymena?
Dunderave as well.
Where?
Dunderave.
Yeah, I don't know, I can't remember. I had it in my head a while ago, but I don't know. But so they clearly have a load of stuff that they can, you know, kind of spread around. And I think that is interesting as well, you know, because it's the piece about Casement. There are Roger Casement collections in the National Museum of Ireland that are, you know, African and so on, that come directly from him. But the broader imperial family history, which is, and his items were explicitly part of an or were constructed as part of an anti-imperial narrative. But the broader Casement family collection hasn't been looked at very much.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. That's been a really fascinating discussion on top of you know, a highly illuminating paper. So thank you very much, Briony. We appreciate you coming and sharing your ongoing research with us, and look forward to the project coming to completion and publications coming out of it. So can we thank Briony for speaking to us this afternoon? And just a reminder, we do have another seminar next Monday at 4:30. We have Joan Nugent, who's our visiting academic researcher from Boston College, speaking on how the Irish smelled civilization. I'm not quite sure what the content of that will be, but I suspect Joyce will come into it somewhere, as Joe is a Joyce specialist. So be very welcome to join us in person or online next Monday for that. Thank you.
Thank you. It's great to have one on Mondays. Lovely to have it.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the slides. I don't know what happened there.
I was probably being a bit candid. I just